Welcome back to Final Fantasy as we continue our dive into the depths of the Earth Cave to confront the vampire, the creature responsible for the Earth's rot, so that we can restore power to the Earth Orb and make our, well, not necessarily our first big step on our quest, but the first big... the first step towards directly restoring the crystals. That whole thing just kind of got away from me. I was trying to make it sound like this was the first real significant breakthrough on our journey or something, but it's not. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I just haven't been finding the time and motivation to sit down and do this. I've actually tried doing it a few times, but every single time I sit down and start talking and then I'm not feeling it or something, or I don't feel good with how it started or some other nonsense. So it's been a while, and I decided to try and get through that funk. I thought I would change the subject a bit. We do still have some stories about the Final Fantasy series from my past that I would like to get into at some point, but today we're going to be taking a detour from that and moving on to something that I wanted to talk about a bit further down the line, but we're changing things up a bit from my original plan. That said, today I'm going to be going over a bit of a countdown list of my, not necessarily my favorite Final Fantasy games. It's sort of a top 10, but not really a top 10. Basically, I'm going to be giving my personal opinions and rankings of the Final Fantasy series, of games in the Final Fantasy series, rather. Now, blah, 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 blah. It's been a while. I tried to kind of get back into the groove of things, and I'm overthinking everything. So, and that's another reason why it's taking so long. I sit down and I overthink what I'm going to say or what I want to say, and then I either just freeze up or something doesn't go exactly how I envisioned it would, so then I just stop, or some other stupid, similarly pointless and arbitrary reason to not keep going, because it's awkward or whatever. But anyway, so this is going to be my top 10 Final Fantasy games, sort of. Now, some rules for this before we begin. Rule number 1, obviously these are my opinions. I'm not providing an objective list of which games I think are sincerely better or worse than others. These are just my own thoughts and opinions about the games. Number 2, we are only going to be covering the main series games. Final Fantasies number 1 through 16. We are not going to be covering any spin-off games like Chocobo Racing or Crystal Defenders. And we're also not going to be going over any prequels or sequels like The After Years or Dirge of Cerberus. We are only looking at the main series, the main numbered entries, 1 through 16, or however many other Final Fantasy games have come out since this video came out, but those aren't really applicable because they're not out yet as I'm recording this. And And the final rule for this, which is kind of an important one, and why it is a top 10 list, it's just coincidentally a top 10 list. Because I'm only going to be discussing the games that I feel I've played enough to formulate a legitimate opinion. Because there are some Final Fantasy games that I don't like. Ones that I either have absolutely no interest in playing or was exposed to from watching friends play the game or playing a demo or just hearing things about it. But I don't feel like it would be fair to judge those games based on what little I've played of them. Because of that, I'm only going to be covering games that I've played enough that I feel I was able to formulate a fair opinion. Some people might not consider all of them to be fair opinions, but an opinion, but enough that I could formulate an opinion to myself of how I feel about the game, as opposed to just having either very positive or very negative first impressions of the game. I need to write something down real quick. There we go. Anyway, so, where was I? Yeah, I'm only going to be, discussing the games that I feel I've played enough to formulate what I would consider a legitimate opinion in regards to my thoughts on the game and my opinion on the games. And between Final Fantasies 1 through 16, it just so happens by pure coincidence. This freaking bat in the game needs to get out of the way, by the way. But by just a pure coincidence, between Final Fantasies 1 through 16, it just so happens that I've played 10 of them extensively enough to qualify for this list. So the fact that it's a top 10 is just 100% coincidental, as opposed to it being a weird number like a top 8 or a top 12. So we're going to be getting into that. And I'm not going to say which Final Fantasy games are on the list, because that would potentially spoil the list, especially once we start getting near the end and it becomes more apparent which ones are still left to discuss. I feel like by not mentioning which entries qualify for this list, there will be a bit more of a surprise or intrigue going forward. Although some of the entries may be a little bit spoiled because of either past instances during this series where I've discussed them, or just videos in the past on the channel that are completely unrelated to Final Fantasy, but I've mentioned specific Final Fantasy games that I've played in the past, so it's not 100% spoiler-free unless this just happens to be the very first video on the channel you're watching. But I want to not mention which entries are on the list in advance, just to kind of help to add a bit more to the mystery of what's to come. Aside from just, again, it only includes numbers 1 through 16. So, let's get started on that. And by again, another coincidence, the number 10 entry on this list happens to be Final Fantasy X. So Final Fantasy X. First of all, I have two things to say at the start. Number one, this is one of only 2 entries on this list that I don't like. Numbers 10 and numbers 9 are games that I genuinely just think are shit. And past that, we get to the good stuff. But these first 2 entries, I legitimately just do not like them. Hello, vampire. Are we going to talk to the... No, we're going to heal up. Maybe. Oh, we don't have much to work with. And I don't even have Fire 3. When I was a kid, I would always have Fire 3 by the time I got to this guy. Because if you blast him with Fire 3, you can take him out in one shot despite him essentially being a boss. But we still have other spells, I guess. Yeah, fire. Anyway. So, Final Fantasy X. It is one of 2 games on this list that I just don't like. But furthermore, it is the only game on this list that I've never beaten. Because I couldn't be bothered to beat it. Because it was just too boring. There wasn't a single thing about it I liked. And I gave it a fair chance. Not only did I pick it up and play it at a point when I was specifically wanting to be playing a RPG, a new RPG, so I was in the best possible mood to be playing the game. I remember I went to GameStop. I was explicitly or specifically or whatever looking for a new RPG to play. And I saw a used copy of Final Fantasy X, and I'm like, you know what? This is a good time to finally give this game a shot. So I picked it up, I took it home, I played it for about a week, and it sucked. And I played it for, I think, about 15 hours before I realized it sucked. But when I realized I hated the game, it occurred to me that I hadn't enjoyed a single minute of it. From the start to, I actually reflected on it. I was just sitting there playing it, doing some battles, and then it just hit me like an epiphany. I'm like, you know what? This game sucks. And I reflected on my experience with it, and it occurred to me that I hadn't been enjoying the game from the very start of it. I've been just bored, and the only reason I had been going with it was because of that aforementioned, just that I was just in the mood. I just had this very strong urge to be playing a new RPG, and that was the only thing driving me forward. And once that sort of, not necessarily hype, but once that mood kind of settled down, it just hit me that I wasn't having fun with this game, and so I just stopped. And like I said, there was not a single thing I enjoyed about it. I did not care for the characters, at least any of the characters I had met. They were all just very uninteresting, or boring, or obnoxious. I didn't like the battle system, not because it was a bad battle system, but because it made a lot of really terrible design choices. And I also didn't like the sphere grid. The sphere grid was just... First of all, when you start the game, having all that information is way too overwhelming, especially with trying to plot your course along the sphere grid, because you'd have to look so far in advance through all this stuff just to decide where you want to go with your growth. And then you also have to get all these items and shit, and you need very specific spheres to get past very specific locks and paths. It wasn't fun. It was obnoxious and tedious. It was overwhelming looking at all that information. It was obnoxious considering the possibility that I could wind up not going down a path I want because I overlooked something or I didn't have the foresight to see where things were going to go in advance. And I didn't like how I just didn't like how tedious it was to try and figure all of that out, especially when I didn't even know when certain paths might become available because of certain spheres I would need. So, and also, I really, really hated how you could eventually get to a point. I didn't get to this point, but you can see it when you're looking through the sphere grid, and I also knew about it from other people talking about the game, but I really, really did not like how characters can intrude upon other characters' sections of the sphere grid. I would have much preferred if each character had their own sphere grid to individualize themselves as characters. And you would just use the sphere grid to determine how you want that character to grow based on what's available to them, rather than being able to intrude on other people's sphere grids and take away what should make those characters unique from each other. Then there's the battle system. Inherently, the battle system wasn't bad, but it had problems that the whole game contradicted itself with its battle system and what it expected of you and made everything tedious. I feel like tedious is the best single word to describe the game. Because, first of all, the game has a system where you can swap your party members freely in the middle of a battle. I like games that do that because it allows you to it allows your entire party to fight more as a group, and it allows you to get use out of all of your available tools, all of your characters, without having an excessively large party, because you can swap your characters freely in and out. Here's the problem. That kind of system only works if all of your characters gain equal experience points regardless of their participation in battle. Final Fantasy X does not do that. A character will only gain experience points if they participated in the battle. In any other RPG, that would be fine. Because you just choose the characters you want to use, and none of the other characters are consequential, because if they're not gaining experience points, it doesn't matter because you're not using them. But Final Fantasy X doesn't work like that. Final Fantasy X is designed for you to be using everybody because of this mid-battle swapping mechanic. But the characters you don't gain experience points that they need in order to utilize this mechanic. So what ends up happening is every single battle, you have to forcefully swap every single character into your party at least once to have them do something just so they'll get experience points for the battle. So what ends up happening is every random battle ends up taking 2 or 3 times as long as it should, because you're needing to toss every single character into the fight and have them smack something. So you're deliberately having to gimp your tactics because you need to strategize not around effectively defeating the enemies, but strategize around how you can swap each character in and utilize them. And it turns into a mess. It turns into just, the battles aren't fun because of it. Because you're being forced to play in this extremely tedious way. And yes, you could just not do that. You could just choose your main 3 guys and stick with them. But then you're completely disregarding what should be one of the best mechanics of the game, and you shouldn't be forced to ignore a mechanic in a game in order to enjoy it. You should be able to utilize all of the game's mechanics to enjoy it, especially when it's one of the mechanics that makes it... It's one of the mechanics that most stands out as unique in the series and in RPGs as a whole, because you really don't see very many RPGs that have that kind of mechanic. So the whole thing just turns into a mess, where you're trying to level everybody up so that they'll be leveled up enough to be able to be used with this swapping mechanic. But then it just makes the entire experience miserable as a result. But likewise, the experience would be miserable if you weren't doing that, because you're only playing half the game, effectively. And then there's also the story. From what I saw, I didn't care about the story. I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't dislike any of the characters, I don't think. From what I recall, I didn't dislike any of the characters, but I also didn't really care about any of them or anything of what was going on. It was a very indifferent experience as far as the story and the characters, at least from what I saw. Maybe the story gets better, but that doesn't matter because inherently all the gameplay elements around it were miserable and boring and uninteresting and tedious. Quick update in this game. We got the ruby from past the vampire. If we had gone further into the Earth Cave, we would have found a panel, and that panel says that, and if you search the panel, your heroes can sense evil emanating from the panel, some sort of dark magic just fuming from it, but you can't go any further. So now we have to come to this cave, which I don't remember if we talked to all the NPCs to figure out this information and explored a bit. I don't believe we did. But we come to this cave because if you had come here before, you would talk to this Titan or Giant, and he'll tell you that he will not let you pass unless you get him a ruby, because rubies are his favorite food. So we found the ruby in the Earth Cave. We bring it to this guy. And we're gonna give the ruby to the Titan, and then he is going to get out of our way so we can advance further. And then we're going to meet a wizard named Sarda, who I believe gets mentioned in the nearby town. And he is going to give us a magical rod, and that rod can destroy the panel in the Earth Cave. And it's beyond that panel that the true culprit of the Earth's rot will be found. The vampire wasn't actually the one responsible for all of this. The people in Melmond just assumed the vampire was responsible because they're not aware of the real cause of the Earth's rot. So that's what's going on in the story and what's coming up in the story, like immediately coming up in the next 5-10 minutes, depending on how battles go. So, there's my thoughts about Final Fantasy X. I don't have much more thoughts. Alright, we're looking at the fighter real quick. I think... Am I trying... Oh no, I'm checking the stats of the Iron Helm versus the Silver Helm. And then I think I'm going to consider the axe. Yeah, I'm considering the axe because the axe has higher attack but lower accuracy by a fair amount. But I feel like, talking a bit about what we're actually seeing in the game for a moment, to me, I feel like whether or not the axe is worthwhile depends on the hit threshold with your accuracy, because the axe is stronger and it may not hit quite as consistently, but it does hit for a little bit more damage when it does hit. But that extra damage is not worth it if you're not hitting as many times. So I feel like the main deciding factor as to whether or not to use an axe or a sword, at least for me, boils down to how many hits you get. In this case, going from between an accuracy of 48 or 58, the maximum number of hits that the fighter can perform is still 2. Whereas if the accuracy for the sword was 64 as opposed to 58, then suddenly the sword would be better because we're getting 3 hits instead of only 2, which would be a far greater damage difference than the increased power from the axe. So for the time being, we're using the axe. Not necessarily because I think it's better or worse than the sword, it's just I usually let it be decided by the accuracy of the hit thresholds. I need to go refill my water bottle, hang on. Ah, there we are. That's better. Okay, so getting back on track. Those were my thoughts for Final Fantasy X. And I'm sure there are people who are going to be like, oh, you didn't play the game long enough. It gets better as you go on, blah, 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 blah. But who cares? I played it for about 15 hours, maybe it was closer to about 12, but still, that's still over 10 hours. And if a game isn't fun by about the 2 or 3 hour mark, then it's no longer worth my time. It doesn't matter if it might get better, because it's not worth the time I'm wasting to get to the point where it gets better. Besides that, even if it gets better, that doesn't change the fundamental problems with the game, and that's my biggest argument with that, is it's not about whether or not the game gets better or whether or not it gets more fun, because all of my primary issues with the game are tied to its fundamental design, and those designs aren't going to change. You're still going to be dealing with swapping your characters tediously in and out every fight so they can gain experience points so that you can utilize the mechanic that you're having to utilize in order to pull that off. or whatever I'm trying to say. And you're also still going to be having to deal with the sphere grid, which is just a piece of shit customization mechanic at its core. So yeah, Final Fantasy X sucks. And nothing of getting better or worse down the line as you get further in the game would fix that, because those fundamental issues would still be present. If anything, I imagine it's getting worse, because as you get further into the game, it would naturally become more difficult, meaning every fight, not only would you have to still be wrestling with swapping your characters in and out, but you would probably have to be doing it with a larger party, meaning more swapping and more tedium, but the fights would also be harder, meaning you would have to be struggling with the increased difficulty while trying to abide to that tedious routine of garbage. Ugh. So moving on, at number 9 on the list, we have Final Fantasy II. Now, unlike Final Fantasy X, I have actually beaten this game, but that doesn't mean I like it. But here's the thing about Final Fantasy II. Unlike Final Fantasy X, where I just hated the game and never looked back, in the case of Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy II is a game I've always wanted to like, because I see so much potential in the game. If only that potential wasn't squandered by being sucky. I mean, I like the customization aspect. I like how your characters grow based on how you use them. It means that your character growth, it's, what am I trying to say? It complements your play style. However you decide to play the game, your characters will grow accordingly. If you're attacking a lot, you'll get strength. Casting a lot of spells, your magic will get stronger. That's a cool idea, because not only are you getting to choose how your characters develop, but they're developing naturally based on how you decide to play the game, as opposed to having to go out of your way to play the game in a very specific way in order to get the growth you want, which may not fit with how you want to be playing the game. Such as what I was just saying with Final Fantasy X's leveling ups, or experience gains. In Final Fantasy II, it's not even so much about customizing your characters in the way that you want down the line. It's not so much like thinking in advance, I want this character to be like this, so I'm going to do this. You just play the game, and your characters will become what you're making them based on how you're playing. You don't have to arbitrarily force yourself to play a certain way or make certain decisions to get the characters you want. You just play the game that's most comfortable or most fun for you, and that growth just happens as a result in response to how you're playing the game. And that should have been a really cool mechanic. But it's not, because nothing about Final Fantasy II is designed well. And I kind of blame system limitations, because I feel like the game tried to do way too much for an NES game. And I also blame just them not knowing what they were doing. Final Fantasy II was extremely experimental. And I feel like they just had all these ideas for the game, but couldn't think of a way to balance those ideas in a way that made the game fun. Instead, it's even more tedious than Final Fantasy X. The only reason I think the tedium in Final Fantasy X is worse is because you're having to force yourself to go out of your way to play the game in a very specific way in order to develop your characters, whereas at least in Final Fantasy II, yes, it's tedious, but at least that tedium comes from, well, mostly comes from you playing the way you want and your characters developing accordingly. The problem is how long that development takes, rather than the fundamental mechanics around that tedium. For example, certain spells are not worth it because they take way too long and way too much time and effort of nothing to be useful. So here's how the spell system works in that game. As you cast spells, you'll gain experience points with those individual spells, and the spells will level up. It's not like this game where there's like Cure 1, Cure 2, Cure 3. There's just the Cure spell, and as you use it, you level it up. But the spells don't necessarily get stronger per se. How the game works is every level that a spell has, the spell has that many hits. And each hit has a particular accuracy or potency behind it. For example, the fire spell. When you cast fire level 1, it hits once. When you cast fire level 5, it can hit 5 times. So that's how the damage is increasing. And it can also vary a bit based on, I think, variances within the damage, but also based on the accuracy of the hits. Like, you might cast fire 5, but I think it might only sometimes hit 4 times or something. The game doesn't tell you any of that, though. I only know this stuff from looking up some things about the game, trying to figure out a bit more about it. But here's the issue with that, is then you have spells like Isuna. How Isuna works, Isuna is a spell that heals status effects. In most Final Fantasy games, it just heals all status effects, or maybe heals a couple of them, whatever. In Final Fantasy II, how it works is the status effect that it heals is it's based on how many hits the spell lands. So it's like, if Isuna hits once, it'll heal poison. If it hits twice, it'll heal poison and also this status effect. If it hits 3 times, and so on. So here's the problem with that. It can take hundreds of spell casts to get adequate levels with spells, and you don't get hit by very many status effects in the game. So you want to know how to get Isuna usable so it can actually work on more powerful status effects like Petrify? You do nothing. Literally. I swear I spent hours upon hours of my time in Final Fantasy II casting spells like Isuna on characters who weren't afflicted with status effects. Literally hundreds of times. Just so the spell could maybe help me once or twice later in the game. And that's assuming it works. There's another spell like that called Basuna, which is Isuna but for different status effects. Basuna is basically for temporary effects that only last for the battle. Isuna is for status effects that stay with you after the battle. And I swear I cast Basuna hundreds of times, getting it leveled up, just in case I need it for something like confusion. So if a character gets confused or silenced, it's like, great, I have Basuna ready. But then even if it's at the right level, it can still fail because it might miss. Like if you get Basuna to level 5 and that's the threshold to heal a certain status effect, it needs to hit all 5 of those times. If one of those times misses, then it won't work. So you have to get it to a higher level to make it more reliable. And keep in mind, end game max level for every spell is 16. But if you're just playing through the game, end game levels for your spells are going to be like 7 or 8. So you're never going to get that spell to a high enough level for it to be useful unless you want to grind for hours upon hours upon hours just so you can maybe use the spell once or twice and have it maybe work or maybe be useful. And that's Final Fantasy II. So much of the game is like that. Weapons aren't. Weapons are just fine. Weapons, you just hit shit with, and your weapons get stronger, and they get stronger. Same with certain spells like attack spells and healing spells. But so many spells require so much time of uselessness to become useful. And yes, those spells can become useful eventually. Spells like Silence or Sleep can become extremely powerful near the end of the game. But that's only after spending 90% of the game casting the spells on enemies that the spell misses because it's not at a high enough level yet, or trying to silence enemies that don't even cast magic just so you can get those level ups, all the while the enemies are beating the shit out of you. The game requires you to play itself as ineffectively as possible in order to play it effectively. But you're not playing it effectively. And that mostly boils down to certain spells. But here's the thing. If I want to play with those spells, I shouldn't have to suffer for it. I feel like a lot of people who play Final Fantasy II would probably just use weapons and attack spells and have a much smoother and productive experience. But then why even have all these other spells? Why even have all these other options? Especially because some people are going to want to use those options, but in order to use those options, the whole game is a disaster because of stuff like that. And I feel like that's the main thing I have to say about it. Is that. Like that's just that's the fatal flaw in Final Fantasy II. If it was a grind heavy game, I wouldn't mind. But it's how you have to grind and how you have to make things take longer than they should just to get some effectiveness out of certain aspects of the game. And again, it comes down to the game squandering its potential because at its core, I like these mechanics. I feel like they could work really well, especially because, as I said, the game plays into how you play. It complements your choices in a way that should be enjoyable, but it's not. Then there's the dungeon design, because that's not the only issue with the game. Now, the dungeon design is not good, but it's not the worst thing in the world. The biggest issue is the doors. The game has a bunch of doors that lead to traps. And these trap rooms, if you step into them, you'll get attacked by monsters. And there's no indication of which doors are traps or which ones are not. And there's so many doors with so many traps, but some of them have items, or some of them might be progress. So the game just forces you into these stupid traps, and it's not, again, that I don't think is the worst thing in the world, especially because those battles are giving you experience points and money and everything, so you're growing from them. It can just be kind of annoying. That, I don't think, is a huge problem with the game. And some of the dungeons, aside from the stupid doors, don't have terrible designs. Some of them have assorted branching paths or interesting mazes, or sometimes you might go down one path of a dungeon and you'll be able to see the other path from it to get kind of an idea of where other routes might lead. Or there might sometimes be interesting secrets to find, or there's not really any puzzles though. The dungeons are still very basic. They're just complicated for the sake of being complicated, I guess you could say. What else can I say about Final Fantasy II? I feel like there's so much I could say about the game, but it's just not coming to me, partly because I'm talking to myself into a microphone, and that's incredibly awkward. It doesn't matter how many times I do it, talking to a microphone is weird. And I could probably do this for another 10 years, and it won't get any less weird, because nobody's responding to me. And that's not how talking works. That's not how conversations work. To carry a conversation, there needs to be somebody else on the other side of it. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. I mean, I'm even sitting here thinking in my head, like, I know there's more to say about Final Fantasy II, but I'm just like, how do I go into it? How do I discuss something without... How do I discuss something with nobody is basically the conundrum. All that said, though, part of me still kind of likes Final Fantasy II, but not in a way that thinks it's a good game. I feel like of all the Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy II has the most potential to improve from a full-on remake. Just completely remake the game from the ground up to fix its problems and make it more fun. And I've even thought of ways to do that. For example, don't have every spell level up at the same rate. Spells like fire and ice, spells like that, it's okay for those to take hundreds of casts to get to a high level because you're organically going to be using the spells that frequently. But something extremely situational like Basuna or the Aura spell, which the Aura spell it adds special attributes to your weapon for the battle that makes it effective against certain types of enemies, like at level 1. I don't know the exact levels, so somebody can correct me on this, but I'm just going to spout random monster types just to get the point across. At level 1, Aura might make you strong against werebeasts, and then at level 2, it might make you strong against aquatic creatures, and then at level 3, it might make you effective against undead. So you cast the Aura spell, and it'll apply auras to your weapon, based on how many times it hits, with the maximum number of possible hits being based on its level. So the higher its level, the more likely it is that you can apply it to a fighter and have them do massive damage to a specific type of enemy, but you're gonna have to be casting it so many times in battles where it's not useful just to get it up to that level. And again, you could get it up to like level 7 or whatever, and be like, okay, now I can do effective damage against dragons. So when I get to one of those near, like late to end game treasure trap chests that have a super powerful dragon in it, I can cast Aura on my guy, and I still won't be able to do effective damage to dragons because the likelihood of it hitting all 7 times or whatever the amount would be to be effective against dragons is so unlikely if the spell is only at level 7 that you're probably gonna not see any payoff to all that effort anyway, unless you go even further with the grinding effort. And you might not even be far enough to do that yet, because battles in that game have levels. Like, each battle in the game has sort of a power rating assigned to it based on the strength of the monsters, and that power rating relative to the level of your weapon or your spell determines how much weapon or spell experience points you gain each time you use it. And if your if the spell or weapon's level is too much higher than the power level or skill level or whatever it's called of the battle, then you won't gain any experience points. So it's not like you can fight goblins at the very beginning of the game until you get all your weapons and spells to level 16. It doesn't work like that. After a certain point, those weapons and spells will cap out at the experience points you can gain from those given monsters. That said, that also means that lower level weapons and spells will level up quicker if you're using them near the end of the game. So if you get a spell way later on, it'll be a little bit easier to get it caught up to at least a decent level against the late game enemies, if you want to do that. Or you can just stick with the tried and true spells that you've been leveling up the entire game and just use those instead. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is a spell like Fire, it doesn't matter if you have to use it hundreds of times to get it stronger. I mean, I say hundreds of times, I'm talking like throughout a good chunk of the game you're using it that much just to keep it caught up with the progressive increases strength of the enemies or whatever. But using a spell like that so frequently, it's fine. That's not a problem, because every time you cast it, even if it's a little weak, you're getting use out of it. But a spell like Basuna or Aura that's very situational and only useful in very specific circumstances, and even then it's only useful if you happen to have it at a high enough level and it happens to be successful in those given circumstances, those very, very specific given circumstances. Having to cast those spells hundreds of times to do nothing isn't worth it, isn't worth that payoff. That's the biggest problem, is the effort isn't worth the payoff. And that's why spells like those very situational spells, should level up quicker. Spells like Aura and Basuna shouldn't level up at the same speed as something like Fire or Cure, because you're not going to be organically using those spells as frequently. There's so specific and few situations where those spells are useful that they should level up faster, so that even if you're only using them when you need them, their levels will still be adequate. Whereas normally, if you're only using those spells when you actually need them, you're never going to need them, because they're not going to be strong enough to fill that need when you do need them. So spells like fire should level up, or spells like Basuna should level up faster than spells like fire because they're more situational. You shouldn't have to go out of your way to make the game more tedious just to make it more viable. You should be able to use each given spell a reasonable amount of time based on how frequently the spell is necessary, and still have it be useful. Or even if you do need to use it in situations where it's not useful to be useful, it shouldn't be that excessive. You shouldn't need to cast Basuna on nothing hundreds of times just to make it useful later on against stronger statuses if you need it. It should be like dozens of times. It shouldn't be so excessive. Spells like that should level up faster than other spells that are less situational. And that goes for status effect spells as well, although I feel like those I feel should be kind of in the middle. Things like sleep and confuse should level up faster than extremely situational spells like Basuna. I keep mentioning Basuna, but that's because I feel like that was my biggest bane. That one spell was the one that made me most feel this way. It made me most feel in my very soul the flaws with this system. Especially because I use it so much, especially while walking through low-level areas, because I never used fast transport, except at the very beginning when I thought I needed to. Like at the very beginning, they give you a ship you can use to get to other areas, and I assumed I had to use that. But later on, I realized I didn't have to use that to get anywhere. You can just take the long way and walk, and I think that's the way to go with Final Fantasy II. I feel like the way to go about it is to always take the long way around, because then you're going to be fighting random battles, and you can be using those random battles to get the development you need without needing to go out of your way to grind. And by that, I mean, I've said this in other videos before, but I don't like grinding in the sense of just walking in circles. I don't like that form of grinding. I prefer to grind as I go. And if that means taking the longer way to get places and grinding along the way, I would rather do that than take the short path to get somewhere and then later on have to grind in circles for an hour because I skipped the grinding that I could have gotten earlier. And I feel like that works in Final Fantasy II decently well. The fights are still going to be tedious, but I never had to stop and grind. All of the grind, and I got through the game just fine. I never had to stop and grind. I got all the grinding I needed out of the game just by walking to places instead of using a chocobo or a ship to take shortcuts. And I also got through the game by, instead of grinding until I was strong enough to get through the dungeon in one go, I would get as deep into the dungeon as I felt comfortable. Then I would leave, resupply, go back stronger with less detours I need to take because I've already gotten some of the treasure chests, already have a better idea of where to go, much like I played Final Fantasy I. And I got through the game without ever needing to stop and grind. I needed to grind, yes, but the grinding happened organically as I was going. I just wish there wasn't that tedious element on top of it with specific spells. And that could be fixed, like I said, by just having certain spells level up faster than others. I actually saw a mod or a patch or whatever for this game that sort of fixed that. I didn't play it myself because I usually prefer to play games in as original of a form as possible. Usually. There are some exceptions. But usually I prefer to play games in a more original form with bug fixes, like I'm doing with Final Fantasy 1. I like bug fixes because they allow you to play the game in its original form as it was intended, rather than in its original form being broken and things not functioning as the developers meant them to. Because obviously a bug isn't an intentional thing. It's an error in the game that isn't supposed to be there. So fixing that allows you to play the game as it was intended rather than as it released. As opposed to something like a hack or a mod that changes fundamental aspects of the game. But there was one that I saw that I actually liked for Final Fantasy II, and I believe what it did was it made it so spells are categorized as white magic and black magic, and every time you cast a spell in that category, you gain experience with all that magic. Although less with the spells you didn't cast. So like if you have a character who knows fire, ice, and bolt, and you cast ice, I believe what the mod would do is make it so you would gain experience points with all three of those spells because they're all black spells, but because ice was the spell you cast specifically, that spell would gain more experience than fire and bolt. So that allowed you to be slowly leveling up spells that you might not be using as often, while using the spells that are a bit more natural and organic to be using in any given situation. And that I thought was neat. I feel like the game would have, and I honestly feel like the game as a whole would have worked a heck of a lot better if it was like that. I didn't utilize that for the reasons I just said, that I'd rather play the game in its natural form, even if that means a worse experience, because then that's how I'm going to judge the game, based on that worse experience. And if there's a mod to fix that experience, then, well, tough shit, I don't care, because that's too little too late, especially because that doesn't fix the game so much as it is lying about the game. At that point, you're basically lying to yourself into thinking the game is better than it is by falsifying the experience through mods rather than playing the game as it was intended. So I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, this game is good, but only if you use mods. It's like, no, then the game's not good. You're just pretending the game is good by changing it. But that's an entirely different topic. There's also Final Fantasy II's story, which it's fine. It's serviceable for an NES game. There's nothing super interesting about it. There's one or two twists down the line. It's exceedingly dark, and I feel like it tries to carry itself on that, on how dark and edgy it is. Well, not necessarily edgy. It's not really an edgy story. It's just very dark with a lot of real downer moments in the story where all hope feels lost, people are dying, the world's being destroyed, and you're just struggling to save it in whatever way you can by defying this evil empire that's out to conquer everything. It's generic by today's standards, I feel like, aside from how dark it is. But it's serviceable. I don't have any problems with the story. It's just there. There's nothing wrong with it, nothing great with it. One thing I will give credit to Final Fantasy II, though, is of all the Final Fantasy games, in my opinion, Final Fantasy II has my favorite standard battle theme. So there's something. And again, I've always wanted to like Final Fantasy II. It's one of those games I always saw potential. I always wanted to like it. I've revisited that game like a billion more times than any other game I haven't liked. Usually, if I don't like a game, I'll play it for a while. I'll be like, this game sucks, and I'll never think about it or play it or touch it again. That's it. You had your first impression, you failed. Get the hell out of my life. With Final Fantasy II, though, I kept coming back because I kept wanting to like it because I felt like there was something there. And honestly, despite hating the game, I could see myself down the line revisiting it because of that desire to like it. But no matter how much I want, and I've tried playing the game several times throughout my life. I've only beaten it once. Well, technically twice, but that's because I beat the game once first on the NES on my own time, and then shortly after that was around the time the Pixel remasters came out, and then a friend wanted to play the game alongside me. So we did that because he wanted to play the Pixel remaster, but he wanted to play it alongside me like we did once with a different Final Fantasy game. But I was not going to buy the Pixel remaster. I'm not interested in any of the Pixel remasters except maybe Final Fantasy III. But yeah, so we were going to do that, but the issue was he was going to be playing the Pixel remaster, so he could get through the game way faster than I could, especially if I was playing the NES version. So for that, I played the PlayStation version. And we played it alongside each other. We streamed it over Discord. I had my game going, he had his game going, and we just played through the game and chatted. It was a good time. I still hated the game. The PlayStation version did a few things that made it a little bit better, although I still wish that they made it that you could see the magic penalties. That is probably my least favorite thing about Final Fantasy II, actually. Not the system itself. I don't mind the magic penalty system, especially because it adds some interesting weight to how you equip your characters and certain gear. For example, weapons like rods and staves are rather weak, so it's like, why would you level up rods to hit things with? Or why would you use daggers instead of swords when swords are just stronger? Well, daggers and staves have a weaker magic penalty, generally speaking. So if you have a heavy magic using character but still want them to be able to do damage with weapons and get other bonuses from weapons, you give them those weapons so that they can still hit stuff effectively with less of a penalty. Or if you want them to just be pure magic, you don't give them a weapon at all so that they can blast stuff with magic without any sort of magic penalty tied to their weapon. And it's the same with armor. If you want a strong magic user, you give them light armor like robes, or just don't give them any armor at all, stick them in the back row. Their defense will be completely useless, so they'll take a lot of damage if they do get hit, but their magic will be more potent as a result. And that can also tie into the level thing, because if you have a character with heavy armor trying to cast status effect spells, or things like Aura or Basuna, then you're going to need to get the spell that much higher for them to work because of how much less likely the hits are to trigger because of your magic penalty from your equipment. But again, I don't mind that system. It's interesting. It's interesting enough that it makes you put more thought into how you're equipping your characters, because instead of just giving your guys the strongest stuff available all the time, you have to consider how you want your characters equipped based on what magic you want them to be using and how much magic you want them to be using. So if you have a character who's like strictly a black mage or something, then you're probably going to want to stick them in the back row with little to nothing, no weapon, and maybe some robes for protection just in case, or just no armor at all to really maximize the strength of their magic. Or if you want just a fighter, a big beefy fighter, give them all the heavy equipment, big swords and axes to just wreck shit. Or if you want a hybrid character, then you're probably going to want to go with like more medium weight or maybe lightweight armor. Maybe heavy armor if you're willing to take that hit, if you want them to lean a little more fighting towards than magic. And give them a lighter weapon like a staff or a dagger so that they can still use their physical combat in addition to having support magic or attack magic or whatever kind of hybrid you want them to be. So I feel like the magic penalty system works in that regard because you have to equip your characters based on what you want, and it adds more merit to a lot of the types of gear as well as the types of decisions you have to make. The problem is, the game doesn't tell you this. I mean, now, to be fair, I'm going to safely assume that the instruction manual mentions the magic penalty system. I've never read the instruction manual, and even if I did, I would have to be using Google Translate because the original NES manual, anyway, was only in Japanese because the game wasn't localized until the PlayStation. So anyway, so maybe the system itself was explained in the manual. But that's not the problem. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that the game doesn't display this information to you. And for how much I prefer playing games in their original form, the one thing I will always give credit to when it comes to remakes and remasters is better feedback and providing the player with more information that the player should have, especially when it comes to information about the equipment they're using or the skills they're using. Stuff like, does this special attack inflict a status effect, or does this piece of armor provide some sort of elemental resistance? Stuff like that should not be hidden from the player. That's the kind of stuff that shouldn't be hidden. Things like enemy weaknesses or how many hit points enemies have and stuff like that. Stuff about the enemies should be hidden unless you cast a spell like Scan. But stuff about your own equipment and own characters shouldn't be hidden. And that's one of the things that's hidden in Final Fantasy II. So unless you either experiment the hell out of every piece of equipment or you just look it up or know this stuff in advance, or take a general guess, you're not going to know which gear is best suited for which type of build you want because the game doesn't display the magic penalties until the Pixel Remaster. The Pixel Remaster finally added that feature where when you equip a weapon or an armor, it shows the magic penalty on the stats screen. And I hated that. I like the system and the idea behind the penalties because of the customization aspects and what you have to consider with equipping your characters and what type of character you want them to be, but I hate how the game doesn't show you these effects, and that is a mod I would use. If somebody put out a patch for Final Fantasy II that just added that, didn't change anything else, and I could just apply it to the game, particularly if I could apply it to a bug fix patch, because I did use a bug fix patch that fixed just like literally dozens upon dozens, if I recall correctly, bugs and problems in the game. I did use something like that when I played the NES version, but if I could just take that and apply to it a patch that does nothing else, doesn't modify or rebalance the game in any other way, but all it does is make it so that there's and I believe there's room too. I don't remember the status screen specifically, so maybe I'm mistaken because it is pretty cluttered with information, so maybe there's no room. But if there's room on the character's status screen, I would love just a mod that all it does is make it so when you equip a weapon that it just shows. Even if it doesn't show right when you equip it, just have a spot on the status that shows your current magic penalty. So you could reference that when you're equipping and unequipping different pieces of gear to get an idea of how each piece of gear is influencing you. Especially because later on, I feel like it's a bit less clear as for what certain things, how certain things affect stuff, especially at least with the translation I was using, because I feel like some gear had some misleading name. Like a piece of armor might sound like a heavy armor, but it's in fact not a heavy armor. But because of the name or image, it seems like it's heavy armor when it's not, or certain armors might have different effects. Like it's not just a flat value for all light armor or all rods. Like there are a few endgame rods that have a much lesser impact on your magic penalty than some of the earlier rods. I think there's even is one rod in the game that is terrible for magic. Just one random rod that's like, oh, by the way, you want to use rods on your magic user? Well, this one very specific rod is terrible for that. But there's no indication of that to the player. So I would love that. That alone, having that information. It wouldn't make me like Final Fantasy II, but it would just be a huge improvement without fundamentally changing the game at all, simply because it's providing more information to the player that should have been available from the start, especially because I could just look it up. So it's just easier to have the information in the game than having to look everything up every single time I get a new weapon and armor and needing to be like, is this good? Is this bad? I don't know. Going back real quick, we're kind of running long here, but going back real quick, I also wanted to say, in regards to the spell level ups, is I also feel like, just real quick, I wanted to also say that I feel like certain spells that you can only acquire late in the game should also level up a little bit, just a smidge faster. Things like Flare and Holy. Spells that you can't get early in the game, at least not reasonably. I think there are some endgame spells that you could get at the beginning if you take like the chocobo across a river or something like, or the canoe across a river and go someplace you're really not supposed to. You'll probably get killed by the random battles, but you could go there. Here we are at this thingy. We've arrived at the Earth Orb. Let's focus on the game real quick, healing up. And here we are going to confront the true source of the Earth's rot. As soon as I have checked all my stuff. Wahaha, the fiend's ball cracks, blah blah blah. In this cloud I am lit, it is Lich, the fiend of Earth. And now we have boss battle! Anyway, so I feel like certain spells in Final Fantasy II that you get later on should level up just a smidge. But only if you can only get them later on. Like, that shouldn't apply to spells that you'll probably only get later on, but you can get earlier from, like, random monster drops. Stuff like that shouldn't be effective, but I'm mostly thinking, I can never remember what spells Lich uses, because he doesn't have an element tied to him. The other elementals all have a much more distinct element tied to them. So I know which anti-spell to use, but with Lich I can never remember, is it anti-lightning or anti-ice? So I just took a shot in the dark with anti-lightning, and it failed. Not that it mattered anyway, because the spell went off after his attack regardless. So even if I had cast anti-ice, we still would have got wrecked. But yeah. I think that's just about everything for Final Fantasy II. There's probably some stuff I'm forgetting, but this is all just off the top of my head. Thoughts about the game. So, Final Fantasy II at number 9. I know I mostly talked about negatives, but that's mostly what the game is. And, I mean, it's... I definitely wouldn't recommend it if you don't like that kind of tedium, because first and foremost, the game is tedious because of that grinding system. Even if you were to go out of your way to grind, you're having to tolerate so much nonsense just to get anything out of it. So yeah, I don't like Final Fantasy II. I did, but it's probably one of my least favorite, or one of my favorite hated games, because it's one of the only games I hate that I could actually see myself kind of wanting to play again if I'm in just the right mood. Like, if I'm in the mood for that kind of tedious gameplay, then I could see myself potentially revisiting the game sometime years down the line. And maybe, again, trying to find more appreciation for it. But I feel like no matter how much appreciation I would find for it, I could never like the game. I would just hate it less. Oh, not a random battle. Surprise, trolls were hiding behind the feed. We defeated him and then these guys pop up and they're like, you killed our master! Uh-oh, hiccups. Anyway, so yeah, this seems like a good time to stop. By the way, for people who didn't know, the reason I didn't cast life on Black during the battle is because life doesn't work in battle in this game. The Altar of Earth. Now, I believe there's supposed to be an effect there, like a magical beam effect when the screen was shaking. But for whatever reason, either I'm just completely mistaken and that effect wasn't added until later versions of the game, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be there. But for whatever reason, it doesn't show up on the Retron, which is what I'm playing this game on, so that I can have a bug fix patch applied to it. And and also so I can record it. That's basically what I use the Retron 5 for. Either to patch games, to record games, or to save in Sega Genesis games, because my Sega Genesis can't save games anymore. It's not the save batteries in the games. My Genesis literally can't save games anymore because of something with its power supply. I looked up the problem online and I saw some other people having it, and I guess with the Sega Genesis, when you save a game on the Sega Genesis, it uses more power than normal to save the game. But when like a part in the Genesis gets worn out after so many years, the Genesis basically can't provide itself enough power anymore to do that. So the game will save, like it'll say, oh, the game saved successfully, blah, 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 but it didn't actually save because the Genesis couldn't provide enough energy or power to actually write the save game. It can't delete save games either for the same reason. It can load them. If there's already a save on the cartridge, it can load those, but it can't save or delete files because of that thing. But I'm starting to ramble. Okay, so we defeated the Fiend of the Earth, Lich, and we have restored the Earth Orb. See, it's glowing in the corner. And now our next objective is blah, 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 somewhere. We have a boat, so we're gonna have to set off to the ocean and just kind of find where to go next. And I guess we'll be doing that next time, and probably next time I'll continue on this list. We got through the 2 bad ones. From here on out, I like the games we're going to be talking about. I'll have negative things to say about them, but I like them. And if I focus more on the negatives than the positives, that's just because I feel like discussing negative things is more interesting. I feel like I have more to say when it comes to negative stuff, because if something's good, it's like, oh hey, that's great. Oh hey, this mechanic of a game is great. Okay, good. I feel like if something's good, that's all you really have to say. But if something's bad, I feel like you gotta elaborate a bit more to justify thinking that it's bad. I guess you could say. Or I just enjoy talking about negative stuff more because I just feel like the negatives make for more interesting talking points than the positives. But we'll get to that next time. We defeated Lich, we got through a couple of the entries. Next time we'll move on to number 8. We still have 8 more entries to go on this list. And with that, I'll see you next time.